Picture this. You're standing in the charred remains of what was once your family's century-old farm, watching smoke still rising from the ashes of your grandfather's barn. The air is thick with the smell of burnt wood and destroyed dreams. And then, as you're processing this devastation, the HOA president walks up to you with a smirk on his face and says the words that would change everything. Go ahead and sue us. See how far that gets you. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness one of the most satisfying legal takedowns in HOA history. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a third-generation farmer who thought he'd found the perfect balance between preserving his family legacy and embracing modern suburban life. What he discovered instead was that some people in positions of power will stop at nothing to get what they want, even if it means destroying everything you hold dear. But here's the thing about pushing someone too far. Sometimes they push back harder than you ever imagined possible. And when Marcus finally decided to fight, he didn't just win. Marcus so completely destroyed his opponents that the consequences persist 3 years later. You see, the HOA board thought they were dealing with just another quiet farmer who would roll over when threatened. They had no idea they were about to tangle with someone who had access to resources, connections, and most importantly, the kind of righteous fury that could move mountains. Marcus Chen never planned to become the neighborhood's most feared adversary. For 37 years, he'd been perfectly content living on the 47-acre property his grandfather had purchased in 1952, back when their corner of what's now Westfield County was nothing but farmland and country roads. The Chen family farm had been a local landmark for generations. Visitors would drive by just to see the pristine white farmhouse with its wraparound porch, the red barn that housed everything from vintage tractors to prize-winning Holstein cattle, and the endless rows of corn that stretched toward the horizon. It was the kind of place that appeared on postcards and made people nostalgic for a simpler time. But as the decades passed, suburban sprawl crept closer and closer to their property lines. What started as a few scattered houses in the distance gradually became full neighborhoods, shopping centers, and eventually the massive Willowbrook Estates development that completely surrounded the Chen property on 3 sides. Marcus had watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Part of him mourned the loss of the rural landscape he'd grown up in, but another part appreciated the conveniences that came with civilization. Better roads, reliable internet, and emergency services that could actually find his address were all welcome improvements. The trouble started in 2019 when Willowbrook Estates formed its homeowners association. Initially, Marcus paid little attention to this development since his property predated the subdivision by nearly 70 years and clearly fell outside their jurisdiction. His land was legally classified as agricultural, with all the protections and exemptions that classification provided. However, the newly elected HOA board had different ideas about boundaries and authority. The association's leadership was dominated by 3 individuals who seemed to view the neighborhood as their personal kingdom. There was Patricia Steinberg, the HOA president, and a retired real estate attorney who approached every situation like a hostile negotiation. Richard Blackwood, the vice president, was a former city councilman who'd developed a taste for wielding power over others. And then there was Jennifer Morrison, the treasurer, whose background in corporate compliance had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of rules, regulations, and loopholes. Together, these 3 had transformed what should have been a simple community organization into something resembling a municipal government, complete with inspections, fines, and an enforcement department that seemed to operate with the authority of law enforcement. Now, you might be wondering how this could possibly affect Marcus, since his farm wasn't part of their community. That's exactly what he thought too, until he received his first letter from the Willowbrook Estates HOA in March 2020. The letter, written on official letterhead and delivered by certified mail, informed Marcus that his property had been incorporated into the expanded boundaries of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association due to a recent zoning review and community enhancement initiative. According to the letter, his farm now fell under their architectural and landscaping guidelines, and he had 30 days to bring his property into compliance with association standards. Marcus read the letter 3 times, certain it had to be some kind of mistake. He called the HOA office immediately, expecting to clear up what was obviously a clerical error. Instead, he was transferred to Patricia Steinberg, who informed him in her most professional tone that there was no error. The association had petitioned the county to expand their oversight authority to include non-conforming properties that impact the aesthetic and property values of the community. When Marcus pointed out that his farm had been there for nearly 7 decades and was legally protected as agricultural land, Patricia's tone shifted slightly. She explained that while his agricultural activities might continue, the visual presentation of his property would now need to meet community standards. This included restrictions on building colors, landscaping choices, and what she delicately referred to as livestock visibility mitigation. Still thinking this was all some bureaucratic misunderstanding that could be resolved with a simple phone call to the county, Marcus thanked her for her time and began researching the legal basis for their claims. What he discovered over the next several weeks would have been laughable if it weren't so concerning. The HOA had indeed petitioned the county for expanded authority, but they'd done so by claiming that properties like his were grandfathered commercial operations that were negatively impacting residential property values. They'd submitted carefully selected photographs that made his well-maintained farm look like an industrial eyesore, complete with dramatic captions about incompatible land uses and suburban blight. Even more troubling, they'd somehow managed to get 3 county commissioners to sign off on their petition without ever notifying Marcus or giving him an opportunity to respond. The whole process had been conducted behind closed doors, with the HOA board apparently leveraging Patricia's legal background and Richard's political connections to navigate the bureaucratic maze. But here's where the story gets really interesting, and this is something that would prove crucial later. In their eagerness to expand their authority, the HOA board had made several significant legal missteps. They'd misrepresented the nature of Marcus's property in their petition, failed to follow proper notification procedures, and most importantly, they'd overestimated the extent of the authority the county could actually grant them. Marcus spent the better part of 2 months consulting with agricultural attorneys, researching property law, and documenting the timeline of events. What he learned was that while the county had indeed granted the HOA some expanded oversight authority, that authority was far more limited than Patricia Steinberg had led him to believe. More significantly, the entire process could be challenged and potentially reversed if proper procedures hadn't been followed. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus requested a formal meeting with the HOA board to discuss the situation. He was prepared to be reasonable, to work out some kind of compromise that would satisfy their concerns while preserving his rights as a property owner. He even came prepared with a proposal for screening vegetation that would address any aesthetic concerns without impacting his farming operations. That meeting, held on a humid Tuesday evening in July 2020, would prove to be the moment when reasonable discourse died and all-out war began. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center had never felt more like a courtroom than it did that Tuesday evening. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio filled with legal documents, property surveys, and his carefully crafted compromise proposal. He'd even brought along photographs showing how similar agricultural properties in other counties had successfully coexisted with suburban developments. The HOA board, however, had already made up their minds. Patricia Steinberg opened the meeting by reading from what she called the official community position regarding Marcus's property. According to her prepared statement, the farm represented a fundamental incompatibility with the residential character and property values that homeowners had invested in when purchasing homes in Willowbrook Estates. She went on to outline a series of demands that were so sweeping they would have essentially ended agricultural operations on the property entirely. The list included requirements that all livestock be removed within 90 days, that the barn be demolished or significantly modified to achieve architectural harmony with residential structures, and that all crop cultivation be limited to decorative landscaping consistent with suburban aesthetic standards. But the most shocking demand came last. The HOA wanted Marcus to pay for the installation of an 8-foot privacy fence around the entire perimeter of his property, at an estimated cost of over $180,000 to shield residents from inappropriate visual elements. Marcus listened to this list with growing disbelief. When Patricia finished reading, he politely asked if he could present his alternative proposal. What happened next would set the tone for everything that followed. Richard Blackwood, the former city councilman, interrupted before Marcus could even open his portfolio. "Mr. Chen," he said with the kind of condescending tone typically reserved for scolding children, "I think you're misunderstanding the nature of this meeting. We're not here to negotiate. We're here to inform you of your obligations as a member of this community." Marcus tried again, explaining that his property had been in his family for generations and that agricultural operations were protected under both state and federal law. Jennifer Morrison, the treasurer, responded by sliding a thick manila folder across the table. Inside were copies of violation notices for every single building, structure, and landscaping feature on his property. The violations were simultaneously petty and comprehensive. His barn was cited for non-residential roof coloring. His vegetable garden was flagged for inappropriate plant species selection. Even his mailbox, a simple black post that had stood at the end of his driveway for 20 years, was cited for failure to conform to approved community standards. Each violation carried a fine of $200 per day until corrected, meaning that Marcus was looking at potential penalties of over $3,000 daily if he didn't immediately comply with their demands. But it was Patricia Steinberg's closing statement that truly revealed the HOA board's intentions. "Mr. Chen," she said, leaning back in her chair with obvious satisfaction, "agricultural properties simply don't belong in modern suburban communities. Your grandfather may have been here first, but times change. Property values in this neighborhood have increased by 340% since our development was completed. Your farming operation is holding back progress and costing your neighbors real money." She paused for effect before delivering what she clearly thought was her trump card. "We're prepared to be reasonable. We've had the property appraised and we're willing to make you a fair offer. You could sell to us today and walk away with enough money to buy an even larger farm in a more appropriate location." The offer, when she finally named the figure, was insulting. They were proposing to pay roughly 40% of what the property was actually worth, and that was based on agricultural land values, not the suburban development potential that made the land truly valuable. Marcus declined their offer politely but firmly. He explained once again that the farm wasn't just a business investment. It was his family's legacy, his connection to his grandfather's memory, and his home. He had no intention of selling, and he certainly had no intention of paying fines for the crime of maintaining his property exactly as it had been maintained for 7 decades. That's when the gloves came off. Over the next 6 months, the HOA board launched what could only be described as a campaign of systematic harassment. Violation notices arrived weekly, sometimes daily. Marcus would wake up to find HOA representatives on his property taking photographs of infractions that ranged from the genuinely ridiculous — his chickens were cited for creating noise disturbances during daylight hours — to the potentially fabricated. The fines accumulated rapidly. By Christmas 2020, Marcus was facing over $47,000 in penalties according to the HOA's calculations. When he refused to pay, they placed a lien on his property and began threatening foreclosure proceedings. But the psychological warfare was even more troubling than the financial pressure. HOA representatives would show up at his property at all hours, claiming they were conducting compliance inspections. They photographed everything: his house, his outbuildings, his equipment, and even his livestock. When Marcus posted no trespassing signs, they were removed overnight. When he installed a gate across his driveway, he received a violation notice for impeding community access. The harassment extended beyond his property lines. Marcus began receiving complaints from county health inspectors, environmental compliance officers, and even animal control, all based on anonymous reports that his farming operations were somehow violating various regulations. Each complaint required time, paperwork, and stress to resolve, even though the investigations invariably found no violations. Most disturbing of all, Marcus began to suspect that someone was sabotaging his equipment and crops. Tools would go missing from his barn. Irrigation lines would be cut overnight. On 3 separate occasions, he discovered that gates to his livestock areas had been left open, forcing him to spend hours rounding up cattle and horses. When Marcus brought these concerns to local law enforcement, he was told that without clear evidence of who was responsible, there wasn't much they could do. The deputy who took his report suggested, with obvious discomfort, that maybe it would be easier for everyone if Marcus just worked something out with his neighbors. By spring 2021, the situation had escalated to the point where Marcus was seriously considering his options. The constant stress was affecting his health, his farming operations were being disrupted daily, and the accumulating fines and legal fees were creating genuine financial pressure. That's when he decided to fight back, but not in the way the HOA board expected. Instead of hiring a lawyer to defend against their violations and liens, Marcus began his own investigation into the HOA's operations. He filed Freedom of Information requests with the county, demanding copies of all documents related to the HOA's petition for expanded authority. He researched the backgrounds of the board members, looking for potential conflicts of interest or procedural violations. Most importantly, he began documenting everything, every harassment incident, every questionable fine, every procedural irregularity. What he discovered was even worse than he'd imagined. The HOA board hadn't just bent the rules in their dealings with him. They'd been running the entire association like their personal fiefdom, with questionable financial practices, conflicts of interest, and a pattern of intimidation that extended far beyond his situation. But Marcus's investigation would soon be interrupted by an event so shocking, so blatantly illegal, that it would transform a property dispute into a criminal matter and set the stage for the most dramatic confrontation in HOA history. Remember, this is just the beginning of how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. It was 3:47 a.m. on June 15, 2021, when Marcus was awakened by a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The crackling roar of a massive fire consuming everything his family had built over 7 decades. By the time he threw on clothes and raced outside, the barn that had sheltered 3 generations of livestock and equipment was already completely engulfed in flames. The fire was so intense that the heat could be felt from 200 yards away, and burning embers were already spreading to nearby structures. Marcus's first instinct was to save what he could. He managed to release the horses from the paddock closest to the house, watching helplessly as they galloped into the darkness. 3 of his cattle, trapped in the barn area, weren't so fortunate. The vintage tractors his grandfather had lovingly restored the farming equipment that represented tens of thousands of dollars in investment family photographs and documents stored in the barn's office space. Everything was being consumed by flames that seemed to burn with unnatural intensity. The volunteer fire department arrived within 20 minutes. But by then, there was nothing to do except prevent the fire from spreading to the house and surrounding woods. It took them until nearly dawn to fully extinguish the blaze, leaving behind twisted metal, charred timber, and the acrid smell of destruction that would linger for weeks. But it was what happened next that transformed this tragedy into something far more sinister. As Marcus stood surveying the smoking ruins of his family's legacy, trying to process the magnitude of what had been lost, a familiar figure approached through the morning mist. Patricia Steinberg, dressed impeccably despite the early hour, walked up with the kind of expression you might wear to offer condolences at a funeral. "Marcus," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, I'm so sorry about your barn. What a terrible accident." Marcus thanked her for her concern, though he couldn't help wondering how she'd learned about the fire so quickly and why she was here instead of at home, sleeping like any reasonable person would be at 6 a.m. But then Patricia continued talking, and her next words revealed the true purpose of her visit. "You know," she said, pulling out her phone and taking several photographs of the destruction, "this might actually be a blessing in disguise. With the barn gone, your property is much more in compliance with community standards. And of course, without the agricultural infrastructure, there's really no reason to maintain the farming operations." She paused to take another photo before delivering the line that would change everything. "I suppose you could rebuild, but that would require architectural approval from the HOA board. And frankly, I don't see us approving anything that would recreate the problems we've been discussing." Marcus stared at her, slowly processing what she was actually saying. His barn had burned down less than 3 hours ago, and the HOA president was already here taking pictures and talking about how this would help their case against his farming operations. But Patricia wasn't finished. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder that looked suspiciously prepared for this exact moment. "Actually," she continued, "this situation has made me think we should revisit our purchase offer. Obviously, without the agricultural buildings, the property value has decreased somewhat, but we're still prepared to make a fair offer, perhaps 75% of our previous proposal given the circumstances." That's when the pieces clicked into place for Marcus. The timing, Patricia's preparedness, her casual attitude about what should have been a devastating tragedy. None of it was coincidental. "How exactly did you hear about the fire?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled. Patricia's answer was too smooth, too practiced. "Jennifer Morrison lives close enough to see the flames. She called Richard and me immediately. As community leaders, we felt it was important to offer our support during this difficult time." But Marcus had already noticed something that made Patricia's story impossible. Jennifer Morrison lived on the opposite side of the development from his property, separated by hundreds of houses and several hills. There was no way she could have seen flames from his barn, especially not in time to call the other board members and have them arrive on the scene before the fire department had even finished their work. That's when Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Patricia with his suspicions, he thanked her for her concern and told her he'd need time to consider her offer. He watched as she and her companions left, probably thinking they'd just delivered the knockout punch in their campaign to drive him off his land. What they didn't know was that Marcus had security cameras. His grandfather had been obsessed with documenting life on the farm, and Marcus had continued that tradition into the digital age. High-resolution cameras covered every major building and access point on the property, recording continuously to a cloud storage system that uploaded footage in real time. While Patricia Steinberg was taking her photographs and making her insulting offers, Marcus was already accessing the security footage from his phone, scrolling back through the hours before the fire began. What he saw on those recordings would not only solve the mystery of how his barn caught fire, it would expose a criminal conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of the HOA board and ultimately destroy the lives of everyone involved. The footage from the camera overlooking the barn area showed two figures approaching the building at 2:15 a.m., more than an hour before the fire began. They were dressed in dark clothing and moved with the careful precision of people who knew exactly what they were doing and where the cameras were located. But they'd made one crucial mistake. In their focus on avoiding the obvious camera positions, they'd forgotten about the motion-activated wildlife camera Marcus had installed to monitor a family of foxes that had been denning near the barn. That camera, hidden in the brush and designed to be invisible to both animals and humans, had captured everything in perfect detail. The first figure was clearly Richard Blackwood, identifiable not just by his distinctive build and walk, but by the Willowbrook Estates HOA jacket he was wearing, Apparently, he'd forgotten that clothing with reflective lettering shows up very clearly on night vision cameras. The second figure took longer to identify, but careful analysis of the footage eventually revealed it to be Jennifer Morrison. The camera had captured her face clearly when she'd turned toward the barn's main entrance, apparently checking to make sure their entry hadn't triggered any alarms. But the most damning footage came from what happened next. The recordings showed both figures entering the barn, remaining inside for approximately 40 minutes, and then exiting while carrying what appeared to be empty containers. 37 minutes after they left the property, the first flames became visible in the barn's hay storage area. Marcus had just documented evidence of arson committed by 2 members of the HOA board. But as shocking as that discovery was, it was only the beginning of what the security footage would reveal. As Marcus continued reviewing the recordings from previous weeks and months, a pattern of criminal activity emerged that was far more extensive than he'd ever imagined. The footage showed HOA board members and their associates trespassing on his property dozens of times, not just for their claimed inspections, but for acts of deliberate sabotage. He watched Richard Blackwood cut his irrigation lines. He saw Jennifer Morrison deliberately leave livestock gates open. Most disturbing of all, he witnessed Patricia Steinberg placing dead rodents near his chicken coops, apparently preparing for the anonymous health department complaints that would arrive days later. But Marcus was about to discover that arson and sabotage were just the tip of the iceberg. His investigation into the HOA's operations had been interrupted by the fire, but now he had both the motivation and the evidence to pursue it with renewed intensity. And what he was about to uncover would make their crimes against his property look like minor pranks compared to what they'd been doing to the entire community. Are you starting to see how deep this rabbit hole goes? Because we're about to discover that burning down a barn was actually the least of their crimes. In the days following the barn fire, while Patricia Steinberg and her accomplices believed they'd finally driven Marcus off his land, he was actually assembling one of the most devastating legal cases in HOA history. The security footage documenting the arson was just the beginning. Marcus's investigation had uncovered a pattern of corruption, fraud, and abuse of power that had been going on for years, affecting not just his property, but the entire Willowbrook Estates community. First, there was the financial corruption. Marcus's forensic accountant, and yes, he'd hired a forensic accountant, because when you're fighting people who've burned down your barn, you do not mess around with half measures, discovered that the HOA board had been systematically embezzling community funds for personal use. Patricia Steinberg had been billing the association for legal consultation fees at rates that were 3 times higher than what she actually paid for legal services, pocketing the difference. Richard Blackwood's construction company had been awarded every major maintenance contract for the community, despite consistently submitting bids that were 40–60% higher than competing proposals. Jennifer Morrison had been purchasing supplies and equipment through companies she secretly owned, marking up prices by as much as 300%. But the financial crimes were just one layer of the conspiracy. The HOA board had been using their position to manipulate property values throughout the community for their own benefit. They would deliberately target certain homeowners with excessive fines and violations, forcing them to sell their properties at below-market prices to buyers who, surprise, turned out to be connected to board members or their associates. Marcus's case was just the most extreme example of this pattern. The board's goal hadn't been to simply drive him out. They'd been planning to acquire his 47-acre property for a fraction of its value and then sell it to a major development company for an enormous profit. The arson had been their final gambit to force a sale, but it had also provided Marcus with the evidence he needed to expose the entire operation. Marcus's legal team, because by now he had assembled a legal team that included criminal attorneys, civil rights lawyers, and specialists in agricultural law, filed criminal charges against all 3 board members. The evidence was so overwhelming that the county prosecutor's office had no choice but to pursue maximum penalties. Richard Blackwood and Jennifer Morrison were arrested at their homes on charges of arson, conspiracy, fraud, and multiple counts of trespassing and vandalism. Patricia Steinberg, perhaps recognizing that her legal background made her the ringleader in the eyes of the law, attempted to flee to her second home in Florida. She was arrested at the airport and led away in handcuffs while news cameras captured every humiliating moment. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with just seeing them face criminal penalties. The civil lawsuit he filed was designed to ensure they would never recover from the financial devastation they'd tried to inflict on him. The lawsuit didn't just target the 3 board members, it went after the entire HOA organization, their insurance carriers, and every individual who had participated in or benefited from their criminal activities. Marcus sued for the value of his destroyed barn and equipment, the cost of his livestock, the damage to his crops, the emotional distress of watching his family's legacy go up in flames, and punitive damages designed to send a message that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. The insurance companies settled quickly, recognizing that their clients had voided their policies by committing deliberate criminal acts. The HOA's reserve fund was liquidated to pay damages. But Marcus wasn't done. He filed additional lawsuits against the county officials who had approved the HOA's expanded authority without proper notification procedures. He sued the real estate investment firm that had been planning to profit from the illegal acquisition of his property. He even sued the security company that had been providing surveillance services to the HOA but had failed to prevent their clients from committing crimes on camera. But perhaps most satisfying of all, Marcus filed a massive class-action lawsuit on behalf of every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates who had been victimized by the board's corruption and abuse of power. The discovery process for that lawsuit revealed the full extent of the HOA's criminal enterprise. Internal emails showed Patricia Steinberg referring to homeowners as revenue sources and discussing strategies for maximizing compliance revenue through targeted enforcement. Text messages between board members contained explicit discussions of how to manipulate homeowners into selling their properties at below-market prices. The most damaging evidence came from Richard Blackwood's own files, which contained detailed spreadsheets tracking the profitability of different enforcement strategies and projecting future income from fines and forced sales. He had literally been treating the Homeowners Association like a criminal organization designed to extract money from residents through harassment and intimidation. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the full scope of the board's crimes became public knowledge. Local news outlets covered the story extensively, particularly after the security footage of the arson was released. The image of Richard Blackwood in his HOA jacket, carrying containers of accelerant into Marcus's barn, became a symbol of HOA abuse that resonated far beyond their local community. The criminal trials were swift and decisive. With video evidence of their crimes and paper trails documenting their conspiracy, all 3 defendants were convicted on multiple felony charges. Patricia Steinberg received the harshest sentence, 8 years in federal prison, plus restitution payments that would consume the rest of her assets. Richard Blackwood and Jennifer Morrison each received 6-year sentences and were ordered to pay millions in damages. But the civil consequences were even more devastating than the criminal penalties. The class action lawsuit resulted in a settlement that required the defendants to pay over $47 million in damages to affected homeowners. Patricia Steinberg lost her law license, her homes, her investment accounts, and her retirement savings. Richard Blackwood's construction company went bankrupt, and he was forced to sell all of his properties to pay court-ordered restitution. Jennifer Morrison filed for personal bankruptcy, but was still held liable for damages that would follow her for the rest of her life. The HOA itself was dissolved and replaced with a new organization that operated under strict oversight from the State Attorney General's office. New laws were passed requiring enhanced financial transparency and limiting the authority of homeowner associations to impose fines and liens. But for Marcus, the most important victory was the simplest one. He kept his farm. With the insurance settlements and damage awards, he was able to rebuild everything that had been destroyed, and more. The new barn was even larger than the original, incorporating modern safety features while maintaining the architectural character that connected it to his family's history. He expanded his farming operations, adding new crops and livestock that made the property more productive than it had ever been. The privacy fence that the HOA had once demanded he install at his own expense was indeed constructed, but it was paid for entirely by the defendant's insurance companies as part of their settlement obligations. Marcus had it built exactly to the specifications the HOA had originally demanded, except for one small modification. On the side facing the Willowbrook Estates community, he installed a plaque that read, "This fence was paid for by Patricia Steinberg, Richard Blackwood, and Jennifer Morrison as part of their court-ordered restitution for arson, fraud, and conspiracy." 3 years later, Marcus's farm has become something of a local tourist attraction. People drive from hundreds of miles away to see the place where one man stood up to HOA tyranny and won so decisively that it changed laws across the entire state. School groups visit to learn about both agricultural history and the importance of standing up to bullies, regardless of how much authority they claim to have. The defendants, meanwhile, are still dealing with the consequences of their actions. Patricia Steinberg is serving her prison sentence while watching her legal career and reputation remain permanently destroyed. Richard Blackwood, released after serving 4 years, works at a hardware store for minimum wage, while most of his earnings go to court-ordered restitution payments. Jennifer Morrison moved across the country to escape the notoriety, but she's still making monthly payments to the homeowners she helped victimize. The real estate investment firm that had planned to profit from the illegal acquisition of Marcus's property ended up paying millions in damages and facing federal investigation for their role in the conspiracy. Several of their other development projects were canceled when investors learned about their involvement in the scheme. But perhaps the most important impact of Marcus's victory extends far beyond his individual case. The legal precedents established by his lawsuit have been cited in dozens of other cases involving HOA abuse across the country. Homeowners facing similar harassment now have legal tools and strategies that simply didn't exist before Marcus decided to fight back. State legislatures have passed new laws limiting HOA authority and requiring enhanced oversight of their financial operations. Insurance companies have changed their policies to exclude coverage for deliberately criminal acts by board members. Real estate attorneys now routinely advise clients about the Chen precedent and how it can be used to challenge improper HOA actions. Most importantly, HOA boards across the country have received a clear message. Homeowners are not powerless victims who can be bullied and manipulated without consequences. When you abuse your authority, when you break the law, when you try to destroy someone's life and livelihood for your own profit, there will be a reckoning. Marcus Chen's story proves that sometimes the best response to someone who says, "Go ahead and sue us," is to do exactly that. And to do it so thoroughly, so completely, and so devastatingly that they spend the rest of their lives regretting they ever challenged you. Today, as Marcus tends to his expanded farm and watches his cattle graze in fields that almost became another suburban subdivision, he sometimes reflects on the irony of the situation. The HOA board's attempt to destroy his agricultural operations actually resulted in those operations becoming more successful and more protected than they'd ever been before. But more than that, their crimes transformed him from a quiet farmer who just wanted to be left alone into an accidental advocate for property rights and a symbol of resistance against institutional abuse of power. The question isn't whether Marcus Chen won his fight against the HOA. He destroyed them so completely that their names have become synonymous with criminal corruption in their community. The question is what his victory means for the millions of other homeowners facing similar harassment from power-hungry board members who think their authority puts them above the law. Because here's the thing about bullies. They keep pushing until someone pushes back harder than they ever imagined possible. And sometimes when that pushback comes, it doesn't just stop the immediate problem. It changes the entire system. So the next time you hear about an HOA board threatening a homeowner with fines, liens, or foreclosure over petty violations, remember Marcus Chen's story. Remember that behind every abuse of power is someone who thinks they can get away with it because their victims won't fight back. And remember that sometimes, when the right person decides they've had enough, the consequences can be more devastating than the bullies ever dreamed possible. What would you do if someone burned down everything your family had built and then dared you to seek justice? Would you have the courage to fight back the way Marcus did? Drop a comment below and let us know. Because in a world full of petty tyrants and power-hungry bureaucrats, we all need to decide whether we're going to be victims or victors.